On the evening of July 1st, 2002, the sky above a small German town would become the scene of one of aviation's most devastating mid-air collisions. 71 people would lose their lives that night, most of them children whose dreams of a summer vacation would never be realized. But this tragedy would not end with the crash. It would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to murder, international controversy, and questions that still haunt the aviation industry today. This is the story of the Überlingen disaster. The town of Überlingen sits peacefully on the northern shore of Lake Constance, known in German as the Bodensee. This picturesque region straddles the borders of Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. The lake's waters shimmer beneath the summer sun, and vineyards climb the surrounding hillsides. It is a place where families come to vacation, where tourists stroll along medieval streets, and where the pace of life moves slowly. But 36,000 feet above this tranquil landscape, invisible to those below, commercial aircraft crisscross the sky at hundreds of miles per hour. On this particular Monday night, two of those aircraft were racing toward each other on a collision course that no one on the ground could see coming. To understand what happened that night, we must first travel to the city of Ufa, the capital of Bashkirian, a semi-autonomous republic in the Russian Federation. Ufa sits between the Ural Mountains and the Volga River, home to approximately 4 million people. In the summer of 2002, 45 schoolchildren from this city were preparing for the trip of a lifetime. These were not ordinary children. Their parents were high-ranking officials in the regional government, successful business people, and prominent citizens. One father served as the head of the local UNESCO committee, the very organization that had arranged this special journey. The children had earned this trip through their academic achievements and extracurricular activities. They were destined for Spain's Costa Dorada, the Golden Coast, where beaches stretched beneath the Mediterranean sun and adventures awaited. Among these children was 14-year-old Kirill Degtyarev, a prodigy who had been painting since the age of 4. Despite his young age, Kirill had already held 2 public exhibitions of his artwork in Ufa. His paintings showed a talent and vision far beyond his years, and those who knew him believed he was destined for greatness in the art world. The children traveled by overnight train from Ufa to Moscow, arriving on June 29th. From there, they were supposed to catch a flight to Barcelona, but fate intervened in the smallest of ways. Their driver took a wrong turn and delivered them to the wrong airport. By the time they reached the correct terminal, their original flight had already departed. For 2 days, the group waited in Moscow while arrangements were made for alternative transportation. Finally, on the evening of July 1st, they boarded Bashkirian Airlines Flight 2937, a charter flight that would take them to their destination. None of them could have known that this delay, this simple mistake of a wrong turn, had placed them on a different flight, at a different time, along a different path through the sky. The aircraft that would carry them was a Tupolev Tu-154M registration Romeo Alpha 85816. The Tu-154 was the workhorse of Soviet and Russian aviation, a 3-engine jet that had been the backbone of Aeroflot for decades. This particular aircraft had been built in 1995 and had served Bashkirian Airlines reliably. In the cockpit that night was an exceptionally experienced crew. Captain Alexander Mikhailovich Gross was 52 years old with more than 12,000 hours of flight experience, including nearly 5,000 hours on the Tu-154. This was not an ordinary flight for Captain Gross. He was being evaluated by Oleg Pavlovich Grigoriev, the 40-year-old chief pilot of Bashkirian Airlines, who had accumulated 8,500 hours of flight time. Also in the cockpit were flight navigator Sergei Gennadyevich Karlov, a 50-year-old veteran with nearly 13,000 hours of experience, and flight engineer Oleg Irikovich Valiev, 37, with over 4,000 hours. Murat Akatovich Itkolov, who normally served as first officer, was also present but not officially on duty due to the captain's evaluation flight. 4 cabin crew members attended to the 60 passengers, making sure the children were comfortable as the aircraft climbed into the darkening sky over Russia. At 10:48 p.m. Moscow time, Flight 2937 lifted off from Moscow's Domodedovo Airport. The children pressed their faces against the windows, watching the lights of the Russian capital fade into the distance. In a few hours, they would be in Barcelona. In a few days, they would be splashing in the warm waters of the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, thousands of miles to the west, another aircraft was making its way through the European sky. DHL Flight 611 was a cargo operation carrying no passengers, but equally valuable to those who depended on the packages in its hold. The Boeing 757-23 APF registration, Alpha 9, Charlie Delta Hotel Lima, had begun its journey in Bahrain, the small island kingdom in the Persian Gulf that served as DHL's main hub in the Middle East. The aircraft made a scheduled stop in Bergamo, Italy, where cargo was unloaded and new packages were loaded. At 9:06 p.m. Central European Time, the Boeing lifted off for the final leg to Brussels, Belgium. In the cockpit were two pilots who had worked together many times before. Captain Paul Phillips was 47 years old and British, with nearly 12,000 hours of flight experience, including more than 5,000 hours on the Boeing 757. He was experienced professional and well-respected among his colleagues. First Officer Brant Campione was 34 and Canadian. He had accumulated over 6,600 hours of flight time, though only 176 of those were on the 757. Before becoming a commercial pilot, Campione had served as an air cadet and corporal in the Canadian Military Engineers. Both pilots were based in Manama, Bahrain, and their route that night was a familiar one. As the Boeing 757 cruised northwest across the Alps, First Officer Campione handled the controls while Captain Phillips monitored the instruments and maintained communication with air traffic control. They had no way of knowing that their flight path would soon intersect with a Russian passenger jet carrying 45 children. To understand what happened next, we must look at the invisible infrastructure that keeps aircraft separated in the sky. Air traffic control is one of the most demanding professions in the world. Controllers must track dozens of aircraft, simultaneously maintaining safe separation while coordinating handoffs between sectors and handling unexpected situations. They work with radar screens that show blips representing aircraft moving at hundreds of miles per hour, and they must make split-second decisions that can mean the difference between life and death. The airspace over Überlingen presented a unique situation. Although it was German territory, control of this particular sector had been delegated to Switzerland through a bilateral agreement between the two countries. The Swiss company Skyguide, a private air navigation service provider, was responsible for guiding aircraft through this portion of the sky from their facility in Zurich. On the night of July 1st, a 35-year-old Danish air traffic controller named Peter Nielsen was working the late shift at Skyguide. Nielsen had lived in Switzerland since 1995 and was considered a competent professional by his colleagues. But on this night, he would face circumstances that no controller should ever have to confront alone. Due to low traffic volumes during the night shift, Skyguide had developed a practice of having only two controllers on duty, though this was technically against regulations. What made this night different was that Nielsen's colleague had gone on a break, leaving Nielsen as the sole controller responsible for the entire Zurich airspace. This meant Nielsen was working two separate workstations, monitoring two different frequencies and tracking all traffic in his sector single-handedly. It was a situation that stretched the limits of human attention and capability. But the challenges did not end there. Maintenance technicians had arrived to work on the radar data processing system. This work put the radar into what was called fallback mode, which meant the data Nielsen was seeing on his screen was slightly delayed. More critically, the short-term conflict alert system, which was designed to warn controllers of potential collisions, was partially disabled. The visual warning that would normally flash on Nielsen's screen was not functioning. To make matters worse, the main telephone lines connecting Skyguide to neighboring control centers were also affected by the maintenance. If another facility tried to call with an urgent warning, their call might not get through. As the clock approached 11:30 p.m. Central European Time, the pieces of a tragic puzzle were falling into place. At 11:21 p.m., DHL Flight 611 made contact with Zurich Area Control Center. Nielsen instructed the Boeing to climb from 26,000 feet to 32,000 feet. The DHL pilots requested permission to continue climbing to 36,000 feet to save fuel, and after a few minutes, Nielsen granted their request. At 11:30, Bashkirian Airlines Flight 2937 also contacted Zurich. They reported their position and altitude flight level 360 or 36,000 feet. Nielsen acknowledged the transmission but did not assign a different altitude to either aircraft. Both planes were now flying at exactly the same altitude on courses that would bring them together over the town of Überlingen. The countdown to disaster had begun. But Nielsen was distracted. A delayed Aeroloid flight was requesting clearance to land at Friedrichshafen Airport, which had limited nighttime operations. Nielsen moved to his secondary workstation to handle this request, attempting to contact the airport by phone. The call would not connect. Technical issues caused by the ongoing maintenance meant the phone lines were not working properly. For critical minutes, Nielsen's attention was focused on the Friedrichshafen situation, while the Russian passenger jet and the DHL cargo plane continued on their collision course. Meanwhile, 180 kilometers away at the Karlsruhe Control Center in Germany, controllers monitoring the same airspace on their radar screens could see what was happening. They watched with growing alarm as two blips moved closer together on the same altitude. The Karlsruhe controllers recognized the danger immediately. They tried to contact Zurich to warn Nielsen. The phone lines were jammed. They tried again. Nothing. In total, the Karlsruhe controllers made 11 attempts to reach Zurich by telephone. Not a single call connected. International aviation protocols prohibited controllers from directly contacting aircraft in another facility's airspace. The Karlsruhe controllers could only watch helplessly as the two aircraft drew closer and closer together, unable to issue a warning that might save 71 lives. At 11:34 p.m. and 49 seconds less than a minute before impact, the traffic collision avoidance system aboard the Tupolev issued its warning. The TCAS, relatively new technology at the time that had only been mandatory in Europe since 2000, detected the approaching Boeing and calculated that a collision was imminent. The system issued a resolution advisory instructing the Russian crew to climb. Almost simultaneously, the TCAS aboard the Boeing 757 detected the same threat and issued its own resolution advisory, instructing the DHL pilots to descend. This is exactly how TCAS was designed to work. The systems aboard both aircraft communicated with each other and coordinated their instructions. One plane would climb while the other descended, creating vertical separation even in the final seconds before a potential collision. If both crews followed their TCAS instructions, they would pass safely with hundreds or thousands of feet between them. But at this critical moment, Peter Nielsen finally noticed the two blips converging on his radar screen. He immediately contacted the Russian aircraft. Bashkirian 2937 descend flight level 350 expedite. I have crossing traffic. The instruction was clear: descend 1,000 feet immediately. In the cockpit of the Tupolev, the crew faced an impossible dilemma. Their TCAS was telling them to climb. The air traffic controller was telling them to descend. In most countries, pilots were trained that TCAS instructions took absolute priority over controller instructions in a conflict situation. But Russian aviation training at the time took a different approach. The Tupolev's manual stated that when TCAS and controller instructions conflicted, the pilots should decide based on the situation. Russian training emphasized trusting the controller. Captain Gross made his decision. He disengaged the autopilot and began to descend, following Nielsen's instruction rather than the TCAS command to climb. In the Boeing 757, Captain Phillips and First Officer Campioni had no such conflict. Their training was unambiguous: follow TCAS. When the system told them to descend, they immediately complied, pushing the nose of the Boeing down. Both aircraft were now descending. The TCAS systems detected this dangerous situation and responded. The Boeing's TCAS issued an increased descent command, telling the DHL pilots to descend faster. The Tupolev's TCAS, recognizing that its climb instruction was not being followed, issued an increased climb warning, urgently telling the Russian crew to reverse their descent and climb immediately. At this point, Captain Phillips keyed his microphone to inform Nielsen that they were executing a TCAS descent. But Nielsen was still talking to the Russian aircraft and could not hear the DHL transmission. Nielsen, unaware of the TCAS warnings being issued to both aircraft, repeated his instruction to the Russian crew. 2937, descend flight level 350, traffic at your 2 o'clock. There was an error in this transmission. Nielsen told the Russian pilots that the conflicting traffic was at their 2 o'clock position, meaning off to their right. In fact, the Boeing was approaching from their 10 o'clock position to the left. The crew of the Tupolev, still descending as instructed, looked out their right windows searching for the aircraft that wasn't there. In the final seconds, everything happened at once. 8 seconds before the collision, the crew of Flight 2937 finally spotted the Boeing 757, but it was not to their right. It was coming from the left, much closer than they expected, and closing fast. The captain immediately pulled back on the controls, trying desperately to climb, finally obeying the TCAS instruction, but it was far too late. The Boeing's crew, seeing the Tupolev fill their windscreen, pushed their aircraft into a steeper descent, trying to pass beneath the Russian jet. At 35 minutes and 32 seconds after 11 p.m., the two aircraft collided. The collision occurred at an altitude of 34,890 feet, almost at a perfect right angle. The Boeing's vertical stabilizer, the tall fin at the rear of the aircraft that controls directional stability, sliced through the fuselage of the Tupolev just forward of the wings. The impact was catastrophic for both aircraft. The Tupolev was cut nearly in two. The structural integrity of the fuselage was instantly destroyed. The aircraft began to break apart in mid-air pieces, separating and tumbling through the thin atmosphere at 35,000 feet. Inside the passenger cabin, the children who had been sleeping or looking out windows were suddenly exposed to the violence of explosive decompression and the aircraft tearing itself apart. The nose section containing the cockpit and forward passenger cabin separated and fell straight down. The tail section, with the 3 engines still attached, continued forward briefly before stalling and falling. Debris rained down over a wide area near the village of Brachenreuth. Some pieces fell into fields. Others crashed through the roofs of buildings. The body of one child landed on the asphalt in front of a bus shelter. Another child's body came to rest in a cornfield. A few were found in the trees where branches had partially broken their fall. The Boeing 757 had lost approximately 80% of its vertical stabilizer. Without this critical control surface, maintaining stable flight was nearly impossible. But Captain Phillips and First Officer Campioni fought to keep their aircraft in the air. For 7 kilometers, they struggled with the crippled Boeing. The aircraft yawed and pitched unpredictably, refusing to respond normally to their inputs. The pilots did everything in their power, using every skill they possessed, but physics and aerodynamics had made their situation hopeless. Near the village of Teisersdorf, the Boeing finally succumbed. It struck the ground at approximately a 70-degree angle, plunging into a forested area. The impact and subsequent explosion destroyed the aircraft completely. The 2 pilots were killed instantly. Within minutes, the first emergency calls began reaching local authorities. Residents of the area reported hearing explosions and seeing debris falling from the sky. Fire departments from Überlingen, Oingen, and surrounding communities mobilized. Police and ambulances raced toward the crash sites. When the first responders arrived, they found a scene of devastation beyond imagining. Aircraft debris was scattered across fields and forests. The smell of jet fuel hung in the air, and everywhere there were the remains of those who had been on board. The search for survivors began immediately, but hope faded quickly. The forces involved in a mid-air collision at 35,000 feet, combined with the fall to Earth, left no chance for survival. Among the emergency personnel searching the crash site was a man who had traveled from Spain as soon as he heard the news. Vitaly Kaloyev was 46 years old, a Russian architect from the city of Vladikavkaz in North Ossetia. He had been working in Spain building a house for a wealthy client when his family decided to join him for a summer vacation. His wife Svetlana was 44 years old. His son Konstantin was 10. His daughter Diana was 4. All 3 had been aboard Bashkirian Airlines Flight 2937. Kaloyev joined the search teams, desperate to find his family. In a field near the crash site, he discovered a broken pearl necklace, its beads scattered in the grass. It had belonged to Diana. Later, Kaloyev found Diana's body. Unlike many of the victims, she was relatively intact. Trees had broken her fall. Svetlana's body was discovered in a cornfield. Konstantin's body had struck the pavement in front of a bus shelter. In a single night, Vitaly Kaloyev had lost everything that mattered to him. As dawn broke over Überlingen on July 2nd, the full scope of the tragedy became clear. 71 people had died. The Tupolev had carried 60 passengers and 9 crew members. All perished. The Boeing had carried only its 2 pilots. Both were killed. But the numbers alone could not capture the magnitude of the loss. 45 children from Ufa would never grow up, never graduate from school, never fall in love, never have children of their own. Kirill Degtyarev would never paint another picture. The hopes and dreams of an entire community had been extinguished in an instant. In Ufa, the news arrived in the early morning hours. Parents who had kissed their children goodbye just days before now learned they would never see them again. The grief that swept through the city was overwhelming. Schools canceled classes, government offices closed, an entire region mourned. The investigation began immediately. Germany had jurisdiction over the crash site, but the airspace had been controlled from Switzerland. Russia had lost citizens and an aircraft. Bahrain had lost 2 pilots and a plane registered in their country. All 4 nations would participate in the investigation. The German Federal Bureau of Aircraft Accident Investigation, known by its German acronym BFU, took the lead. Investigators recovered the flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders from both aircraft. They analyzed radar data, reviewed communications tapes, and interviewed everyone who had been involved in the events of that night. The investigation would take nearly 2 years to complete, but the basic facts emerged quickly. The direct cause of the collision was the failure to maintain adequate separation between the 2 aircraft. Peter Nielsen, the air traffic controller, had been the only person in position to prevent the disaster, and he had not recognized the conflict until less than a minute before impact. But the investigation went deeper, examining the systemic failures that had created the conditions for disaster. Skyguide's practice of having only 2 controllers on duty during night shifts and tolerating situations where one controller handled all traffic alone violated their own procedures. Nielsen's colleague had been on an authorized break, but the system that allowed such situations to occur was fundamentally flawed. The maintenance being performed that night had degraded multiple safety systems. The radar was in fallback mode with delayed data. The short-term conflict alert system was partially disabled. The telephone connections to neighboring control centers were impaired. These degradations were not unknown to Skyguide management, yet flights continued to be controlled under these conditions. Nielsen had been overwhelmed trying to handle the Friedrichshafen aircraft while the 2 larger jets converged. His attention had been divided at the worst possible moment. The investigation also examined the actions of the Russian crew. They had received conflicting instructions from their TCAS and from air traffic control, and they had chosen to follow the controller. This decision was consistent with their training, but it proved fatal. If both crews had followed their TCAS instructions, the collision would not have occurred. The Boeing would have descended while the Tupolev climbed, and the 2 aircraft would have passed with safe separation. In May 2004, the BFU released its official report. The primary causes were identified as deficiencies in the Swiss air traffic control system and unclear procedures regarding the use of TCAS. The report contained numerous recommendations for improving aviation safety, including better training for pilots on TCAS procedures and improvements to air traffic control staffing and equipment. But by the time the report was released, another tragedy had already occurred. Peter Nielsen had been deeply affected by the collision. He required medical attention for traumatic stress and eventually resigned from his position at Skyguide. His colleagues maintained a vase with a white rose at his former workstation in his memory. Nielsen moved back to his home in Kloten, a suburb of Zurich, where he lived with his wife and 3 young children. He tried to rebuild his life, but the weight of what had happened pressed down on him constantly. Vitaly Kaloyev could not move on. After the crash, he spent months at the graves of his wife and children, building a shrine to them in his home. He wanted answers. He wanted accountability. Most of all, he wanted someone to acknowledge what had been taken from him. At the memorial service marking the 1st anniversary of the disaster, Kaloyev approached the head of Skyguide and asked about the possibility of meeting the controller who had been on duty that night. He received no response. Kaloyev then hired a private investigator in Moscow to locate Peter Nielsen's address. When he found it, he made his decision. On the afternoon of February 24, 2004, Kaloyev traveled to Kloten. He found Nielsen's house and sat in the garden waiting. A neighbor noticed him and asked what he wanted. Kaloyev showed a piece of paper with Nielsen's name on it. When Nielsen came outside to see who was in his garden, Kaloyev confronted him. Nielsen's wife tried to call her children back inside, but they followed their father into the garden. What happened next occurred in front of Nielsen's family. Kaloyev showed Nielsen photographs of his dead children. He demanded an apology. The conversation grew heated. Then Kaloyev drew a knife and stabbed Peter Nielsen multiple times. Nielsen's wife heard a scream from inside the house. By the time she reached her husband, it was too late. Peter Nielsen died from his wounds. He was 36 years old. Swiss police found Kaloyev at a nearby motel the following day. He was arrested and charged with the premeditated killing of Peter Nielsen. The murder shocked the aviation community. Nielsen had been a victim of circumstances beyond his control, trapped in a system that had set him up to fail. Now he had paid the ultimate price, killed by a man consumed by grief and a desire for revenge. But the reaction in Russia was different. Many viewed Kaloyev not as a murderer, but as a father who had done what any father would do. In a culture that valued family honor and personal accountability, Kaloyev's actions resonated with millions who understood the depth of his loss. In October 2005, a Swiss court convicted Kaloyev of the premeditated killing of Peter Nielsen and sentenced him to 8 years in prison. But the case was far from over. Kaloyev's defense had argued that his mental state following the loss of his family should be taken into account. The Swiss Supreme Court agreed, and in 2006 his sentence was reduced to 5 years and 3 months. In November 2007, Kaloyev was released from prison after serving only 3.5 years. He had been granted parole because his psychological condition had not been adequately considered in the original sentencing. When Kaloyev returned to his hometown of Vladikavkaz in North Ossetia, he was greeted by cheering crowds. Members of the youth movement, Nashi, displayed banners reading, "You are a real man in Ossetian." To many in Russia, he had become a hero, a father who had avenged the deaths of his children. In January 2008, Kaloyev was appointed Deputy Minister of Construction for North Ossetia. The appointment drew international criticism, but in his home region, it was seen as an appropriate recognition of a man who had suffered greatly and acted according to his conscience. Kaloyev held this position until 2016, when he retired on his 60th birthday. On that occasion, he was awarded the highest state medal of North Ossetia, the Medal to the Glory of Ossetia, for his contributions to improving living conditions and educating the younger generation. He has never expressed regret for killing Peter Nielsen. In interviews, he has said that Nielsen paid the price for his incompetence and that those who call him a murderer would betray their own families. The legal aftermath of the Überlingen disaster continued for years. In August 2006, Swiss prosecutors filed manslaughter charges against 8 employees of Skyguide. The trial examined the institutional failures that had contributed to the collision. In September 2007, the verdict was announced. 3 managers at the control center were convicted and given suspended prison sentences. They had tolerated the single controller policy that violated safety regulations. A 4th employee, a project leader overseeing the maintenance work, was ordered to pay a fine. 4 other Skyguide employees were acquitted of any wrongdoing. The court made clear that the collision could have been prevented if 2 controllers had been on duty. Peter Nielsen had been placed in an impossible situation by his superiors, and the management of Skyguide bore responsibility for the systemic failures that night. Skyguide accepted partial responsibility and offered compensation to the families of the victims. The amounts were approximately 30,000 to 36,000 Swiss francs per family, equivalent to roughly 22,000 to 27,000 US dollars at the time. Many families found these amounts insulting given the magnitude of their loss. Appeals for higher compensation were denied by the Swiss federal court. The town of Überlingen established a memorial at the crash site near Brockenreute. It is called the Broken Pearl Necklace, named after the necklace that Vitaly Kaloyev found in the field where his daughter's body came to rest. The memorial features scattered pearls represented in stone, a permanent reminder of the lives lost and the innocence destroyed. Another memorial stands in the southern cemetery of Ufa, where many of the victims are buried. Each year, families gather to remember the children who never came home. At Skyguide headquarters in Zurich, Nielsen's former colleagues maintain a white rose at his workstation. It stands as a quiet tribute to a man who was destroyed by the very system he served. The Überlingen disaster led to significant changes in aviation safety. The most important change involved TCAS procedures. Before the collision, there was ambiguity about what pilots should do when receiving conflicting instructions from TCAS and air traffic control. Different countries had different protocols, and the Russian approach of allowing pilots to decide had proven fatal. After Überlingen, international aviation authorities clarified that TCAS resolution advisories take absolute precedence over air traffic control instructions. If TCAS tells you to climb, you climb, regardless of what the controller says. This simple principle is now drilled into every commercial pilot. The TCAS system itself was upgraded. A new feature called RA reversal was implemented. If one aircraft does not follow its TCAS instruction, the system can now reverse the instruction given to the other aircraft, potentially preventing a collision even when one crew fails to comply. Additionally, an automatic downlink system was developed that alerts controllers when TCAS advisories are issued to aircraft under their control. This gives controllers real-time information about collision avoidance maneuvers being performed by aircraft. Air traffic control procedures were also strengthened. Single controller operations during any shift, regardless of traffic volume, became unacceptable. Backup systems and communication redundancy were improved to ensure that maintenance activities could not degrade safety-critical functions. These changes have undoubtedly saved lives, but they came at a terrible cost. 71 people died on the night of July 1, 2002. 45 children who should have spent the summer on a Spanish beach instead fell from the sky over Germany. 2 professional pilots who were doing their jobs correctly died because another aircraft did not follow TCAS instructions. A Russian family was erased from existence. A Danish air traffic controller was murdered by a grieving father. And, in the end, no one was truly held accountable. The Skyguide managers received suspended sentences. Kaloyev served 3.5 years for murder. The systemic failures that allowed the tragedy to occur were attributed to institutional practices rather than individual decisions. The Überlingen disaster reminds us that aviation safety is built on layers of redundancy, any one of which can fail. It reminds us that human beings operating complex systems can be overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. It reminds us that the consequences of failure in aviation are absolute and irreversible. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us of the human dimension of every aviation statistic. Behind every number is a story. Behind every victim is a family. Behind every tragedy is a cascade of small failures that in hindsight seem almost inevitable. In Ufa, the families of the children still gather each July to remember those they lost. The paintings of Kirill Degtyarev are displayed in exhibitions, his talent frozen forever at 14. The Broken Pearl Necklace Memorial stands in a German field, its scattered stones marking the spot where innocents died. And in Vladikavkaz, an aging architect lives with his memories of a wife and children he will never see again, and of the man he killed in their name. The sky above Überlingen is quiet now. Aircraft still cross this patch of airspace every day, their passengers unaware of the tragedy that occurred here more than 2 decades ago. The systems have been improved, the procedures have been changed, the lessons have been learned. But for those who lost everything on that summer night in 2002, no improvement, no procedure, no lesson can ever bring back what was taken from them. They can only remember and hope that it never happens again.